In a recent podcast, Rhett McLaughlin chatted with atheist Alex O'Connor about why he left the faith. When they got to discussing the resurrection, the takes were pretty rough. First up, Alex questions the burial story. He thinks that there's reasons to be suspicious, like the details get more polished as the Gospels go on.
But I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb. So like in Mark's Gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in a tomb. In Matthew's Gospel, it becomes a new tomb. And then I think by Luke, it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an early apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid.
Right.
So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone stole the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb.
Alex's gradual development theory sounds pretty devastating until you actually look at the text. If the gospel writers were really collabing to craft a myth, you would expect a much smoother narrative buildup, each detail reinforcing the last, escalating the grandeur. But that's not at all what we see. What we see instead is some messy variation, uncoordinated emphasis, and even omissions of the strongest points. This doesn't at all look like collusion, it looks like independent testimony. Take this one example. Mark is the only one who mentions that Pilate was surprised that Jesus died so quickly and double-checked with the centurion before releasing the body. That's actually a pretty powerful apologetic detail right in the very earliest gospel. Luke and Matthew, who were written later, leave it out. And our latest gospel, John, doesn't record Pilate's surprise or the conversation with the centurion, but he does note the soldiers didn't break Jesus' legs because they saw that he was already dead, and one of them pierced his side with a spear just to be sure. Now, here's the punch. Mark shows Pilate seeking confirmation, but he doesn't say how the centurion knew that Jesus was dead. John shows how the death was confirmed, but he never mentions anyone requesting that confirmation. When you put them together, they click in an undesigned way that doesn't look like copying, but they form a fuller, coherent picture. The same thing goes with Joseph of Arimathea. Mark says that he took courage to ask Pilate for the body, but why would he need courage? Mark doesn't explain. John fills in the gap. Joseph was a secret disciple who had been afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Mark's comment makes sense. Joseph took courage because he had reason to be afraid. But what does John do? He drops the praise entirely. If John were just copying and upgrading Mark, you'd expect him to amplify Joseph's bravery, not undermine it. Instead, John highlights that Joseph had been a secret disciple for fear of the Jews. That's not at all heroic progression. That's actually a demotion. What's interesting is that earlier in the same gospel, John explicitly throws shade on people who believe in him but kept quiet out of fear. John 12:43 says, "They love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God." Meanwhile, Mark calls him brave. Luke calls him righteous and even goes out of his way to tell us that Joseph had not consented to their decision and action regarding Jesus' death. This isn't literary development. It's honest, independent reporting where two different writers give you the same character from opposite angles. And look what else they leave out. Mark names the women who saw where Jesus was buried. Luke confirms that they were there, but he doesn't name them. John leaves them out entirely. John adds Nicodemus and burial spices, but he doesn't say anything about the tomb being Joseph's or carved from the rock. Still, the use of spices fits with Jewish burial customs. The Talmud talks about how they were used to honor the dead and mask odor. Luke calls the tomb unused, but not new, but why would he need to? If Joseph was alive, it wouldn't have had any prior use. Alex's argument from silence is just really weak here. Matthew says it was new and that Joseph owned it, but he drops his whole council membership thing, which Mark includes. So if the gospel writers were just smoothing out a legend, why would they toss out some of their best apologetic upgrades? Why not stack the deck? If you're looking for what real legendary development looks like, look no further than the Gospel of Peter, where Jesus comes out of the tomb as a skyscraping giant and a cross literally starts talking. It's all cinematic, super airtight, and shamelessly fake. But the canonical Gospels are raw, they leave things out, they contradict the legend-building formula really at every turn. That's why they feel real.
Dale Allison talks at length about the raising of the graves in Matthew's gospel
Yep.
at the time of Jesus'
Which
death.
is bonkers.
It's absolutely bonkers. But it's really strange how it's worded as well, because it says that when Jesus dies, it says at that moment when he dies, there's a great earthquake and all the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem appear to people after the resurrection. And it's a really weird, clunky wording, because it says that the graves opened when Jesus died, but then it said that the people appeared to many after the resurrection, as if like they were just laying dead in the open tomb for 3 days or something. Like, it's weirdly worded, and you've got this, and Matthew's the only one who reports it, and you've got this undertone of Jesus being the firstborn of the dead, and it's like, okay, like Dale Allison is pretty convinced this didn't actually happen.
The signature skeptic classic, Matthew zombies. First, the argument from silence here is incredibly weak. Matthew doesn't say how many people were raised, how long they were alive, or who exactly saw them. The account is short, vague, and somewhat messily stated, and never picked up again, not in Acts, not in any epistle, not even by Matthew himself as an argument for Jesus' resurrection. If this really was some apologetic invention made to make the resurrection look more impressive, why would you bury it in 2 verses and then never mention it again? That's not how people usually would write persuasive fiction. It doesn't look like something that's really meant to dazzle people. It just looks like something Matthew genuinely thought happened and that he didn't feel the need to embellish. Second, let's be honest. Just because something sounds strange, it doesn't mean that it's false. History is full of all kinds of odd events, and Matthew doesn't describe the dead walking around like extras from The Walking Dead. If a few dozen saints appeared quietly to individual people, that still fits what Matthew says, many appeared to many. That kind of event wouldn't make for a great apologetic, it wouldn't be public, dramatic, or widely known, but it would affect those who saw it and maybe raise the prior probability that Jesus rose from the dead. That fits a pattern that we often see in ancient history, brief, unexplained mentions of things that matter to people involved, but weren't as intended to be some sort of headline-grabbing proof. Third, we don't evaluate every passage in a vacuum. This is where the philosophical idea of epistemic routing comes in. Lydia McGrew talks about this in a video on this very topic, and I'll be sure to share it in the description. But basically, in a nutshell, you judge claims like this based on what you already know about the source. If Matthew already has a strong track record, accurate names, locations, customs, and political details, then when he does finally say something that's really weird, the right response isn't to automatically dismiss him. We ought to pause and say, okay, well, Matthew's pretty reliable, so maybe this did happen. I know it sounds crazy, but think about this for just a second. If your neighbor once told you that he beat up 3 guys who tried to mug him in a dark alley, you might be skeptical. But if you later find out that he's a trained MMA fighter and he has the receipts to prove it, then suddenly that story wouldn't seem to be so far-fetched. So that's the point here. Matthew's showing that he's reliable over and over and over again. So when he says something a little bit crazy, we shouldn't just automatically assume that he's making things up. Finally, if Jesus really rose from the dead, and I'd argue that the broader historical case strongly supports that claim, then this detail about a few other people being raised isn't really a wild leap. It's not all that absurd. If God rose Jesus from the dead, then raising a few saints around the same time isn't a stretch. It's just a ripple effect. Sure, it's unexpected and kind of weird, but once you accept the central event, the smaller detail becomes a whole lot easier to believe.
And if you start to notice apologetical motivations, potentially, in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit. Like how Matthew's gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb.
Right.
And we're told why the guards, like we're told by Matthew essentially why he's included the story of the guards, because they are like, Jesus is gone, and the Jews pay the guards and say, you're going to spread the rumor that the body got stolen. That's what you're going to do. And the guards are like, sure thing, we'll do that. We'll take that money. And this is a rumor that still persists to this day, says Matthew's gospel.
And what's the best explanation for that?
Is it like there were actually guards and Matthew is the only person who happened to report them? Or has Matthew invented the guards as an apologetical tool?
This guard at the tomb thing from Alex is another classic argument from silence. But as I've talked about many times on this channel, arguments from silence can often lead us astray. Philosopher Tim McGrew lays out, silence only counts if you can show 3 things. First, that the author would have known about the event. Second, that he definitely would have recorded it. And third, that the record would have actually survived. If you miss any of those, then your whole argument falls apart. And we know that history is full of cases where important stuff doesn't get mentioned. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD is one of those cases. Pliny the Younger gives us a detailed eyewitness account, but he never mentions that Pompeii or Herculaneum were destroyed. It's not like he didn't know. He was there, he saw it, but for whatever reason, he left that part out. And for whatever reason, Suetonius doesn't mention those cities either, but we don't from there assume that these cities weren't destroyed when we've literally dug them out of the ground. Or what about Socrates? You would think that Thucydides, writing about Athens during the exact time Socrates was alive, might mention the most famous philosopher in the city, but for whatever reason, he doesn't. So I think you guys are getting my point. When critics point out that Mark, Luke, and John don't mention the guard of the tomb, that doesn't prove much of anything. It just proves that they didn't mention it. That's it. If Matthew was just making this up as an apologetic, you would actually expect the story to get picked up and expanded by the others. But it doesn't show up again until the Gospel of Peter much later, and there it's bloated with those fantasy elements that we already talked about. Matthew's version, on the other hand, is pretty simple, grounded, and I would say even plausible. And one more thing, if Matthew really was the author of his Gospel, and he's a tax collector, then wouldn't you think that this would be the exact kind of story that he'd care about? You got bribery, fraud, cover-up, funded by hush money. That's not just a theological point, that's actually his professional interest. He probably would have noticed and would have been interested in reporting it. So far, Alex's arguments are really unimpressive.
It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. Probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective.
So Rhett seems to start with the assumption that the resurrection appearances are like some vague spiritual experience, something the disciples just misinterpreted in their grief. Maybe it was a hallucination, maybe it was mass hysteria, but there is no need for a miracle, just a mistake. But I don't think that works very well, not when you actually look at what they claimed. We're not talking about a handful of emotional people seeing a shadow or a figure in the clouds and just running with it. The disciples claimed, at least, that they had extended conversations with Jesus in groups, that they touched him, that he ate with them, and on multiple occasions. They said that they spent 6 weeks with him after rising, and then he physically ascended into heaven, distinguishing those meetings from later spiritual experiences. That's not religious hysteria, that's detailed multi-sensory interaction over time across multiple locations, multiple groups of people, including skeptics like Thomas and James who had no reason to play along. If they were making that all up, then that's a lie. If they actually experienced those things, they weren't just mistaken. You don't hallucinate eating fish with someone and then have everyone else in the room confirm it. So what's the skeptic's best move? It's to claim that these stories were just all made up later and that the disciples never actually claimed any of that. But now you're not just doubting a miracle, you're doubting the entire character of the gospel authors. What you're saying is that they crafted intricate fictions about group meals, physical contact, and lengthy conversation, and passed them off as real. But here's the problem with that. The gospel authors show every sign of being careful and honest and close up to the facts. Since Rhett thinks that Matthew is so suspect, I'll discuss just a couple of examples here from Matthew that show that he's an honest and knowledgeable reporter. And if you want more of this kind of thing, be sure to check out my playlist on undesigned coincidences, and also my other playlist, How History Backs the Bible. So in Matthew 2, we're told that Herod the Great died. An angel told Joseph that it was safe to return to Israel. So Joseph starts heading back to Judea, but then he changes course when he hears that Herod's son Archelaus is now reigning there. The text says that he was afraid, but it doesn't tell us why. And that raises the obvious question, what about Archelaus was so scary to Joseph? Enter Josephus, the first century Jewish historian. In Antiquities 17, 188, he tells us that after Herod's death, his kingdom was divided between 3 sons. Archelaus got Judea, Antipas, his brother, ruled Galilee. But then things got ugly. Josephus says that during Passover, a crowd gathered to protest the execution of 2 Jewish teachers who had torn down a Roman eagle Herod placed in the temple. Archelaus responded by sending in soldiers to surround the temple and crush the protest. In Antiquity 17:9-3, his forces slaughtered 3,000 people right there in the temple courts and then canceled the festival, sending pilgrims home. Now, imagine Joseph, Mary, and Jesus returning from Egypt, and Archelaus had just launched this brutal massacre. Pilgrims are fleeing Judea, and Joseph hears what's going on. He doesn't need another dream at this point, he just needs a little bit of common sense. So he diverts to Galilee, where Herod Antipas rules instead. Matthew doesn't explain any of this. Archelaus isn't even mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. But Josephus gives us all the context and shows us that Matthew actually knew his stuff. Another example is in Matthew 14:1-2, where we're told that Herod Antipas hears about Jesus and says to his servants, "This is John the Baptist raised from the dead." But the question is, how in the world would Matthew know what Herod said privately to his own staff? Now, if you flip over to Luke 8:3, you find this casual detail. Among Jesus' female followers is a lady by the name of Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. Here's the thing, Luke isn't commenting on Herod's reaction or trying to explain Matthew. He's just listing off some names of female followers. But suddenly, it makes perfect sense how this info would have reached Jesus' followers. If Joanna was a disciple, and her husband was working in Herod's household, news like this wouldn't stay secret for very long. This is what scholars call an undesigned coincidence. Luke and Matthew independently drop details that unintentionally fit together like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. It's not something that you would expect from fiction or legend. It's this kind of quiet incidental harmony that is best explained by saying that we're dealing with real history here. These are just a couple examples of eyewitness level details. There are literally hundreds of these found in the Gospels and Acts that I talk about in other videos.
I ended up writing this like pamphlet. I would do this all the time. I would write like little papers or pamphlets or whatever. And there was one that was like, this is what you need to say the next time the Mormons come to your door, right? Because you can take apart their theology and their history in a much, it's so recent, right? So that was my perspective. And I find it so interesting that the average Christian apologist, the level of scrutiny they apply to criticizing Mormonism, if they would just for a moment turn that level of scrutiny on their own story, you'd be like, guys, come on, do you see what you're doing? Or like, and if you had been born in a Muslim country and you were of the Muslim faith and you didn't believe that Jesus actually raised from the dead, what would your Muslim apologetic about the resurrection be? Like, do you really think these arguments are as strong, or is it just you need them to be true?
This was one of the most frustrating parts for me, Rhett saying that Christian apologists are just twisting themselves in the same kind of mental gymnastics that Muslims and Mormons do, but that's just a false equivalence. For starters, Islam and Mormonism rely on what we've called before in previous videos a self-certifying strategy. That is, when a prophet suddenly reveals a conveniently lost prophecy about himself. Think about Genesis 53 in the Mormon scripture. It's not in any of your Old Testaments. Genesis 50 ends at verse 23. But in Joseph Smith's translation, Joseph of Egypt allegedly predicts the coming of, you guessed it, Joseph Smith. Or think about Surah 61:6, where Jesus supposedly predicts that Muhammad is coming and names him. These prophecies appear nowhere else, only in the religion that's actually trying to prove itself. That's obviously not prophecy, that's just you backfilling your own origin story, like giving yourself a 5-star review or writing your own job reference. There's nothing in Christianity that's like that. Nowhere do we see Jesus appealing to some lost scripture in order to validate himself. His followers cite real texts, not mysterious revelations that no one's ever heard of. And then there's history. Islam's whole Mecca narrative. Scholars like Patricia Crone have pointed out that there's actually no solid evidence that Mecca was even a religious hub in the 6th century. And Mormon archaeology exists in a total vacuum. There's zero support for its claimed civilizations. So no, Christianity is not in the same category at all. It doesn't rewrite history or invent prophecy. The case for the gospel stands on actual evidence that I've discussed in this video, not on just cheap narrative tricks. The fact is, I actually do apply a very high level of evidential scrutiny on all religions, including my own. If Christianity isn't true, then I would actually want to know that and not waste my life on it. Rhett and Alex throw a lot of shade, but to me it feels like just a lot of vibes and vague impressions. Their objections sound deep, but if you actually know the case for the Gospels, you realize that they've actually just barely scratched the surface.